right.
Some remarks about my more recent research. I wrote this book quite a while ago. In my opinion, the most important conclusion by far to emerge from my research on Khrushchev's secret speech is not the fact that this one speech contains virtually nothing but falsehoods, but in what that means for our understanding of other cardinal events in Soviet history, and especially of the Stalin period. I completed this book at the end of 2006. I wrote the introduction in January 2007. I updated it with a little new documentation about a year ago in preparation for the English edition. But basically, since 2007, I have been doing further research into important questions of Soviet history during the Stalin period. Some done with my Moscow colleague Vladimir Bobrov, some done by myself. You can see everything that has appeared in print so far on my webpage. I'll give you the URL later on. In 2009, a couple of examples of this research that I've done since finishing the Khrushchev book, okay? In 2009, I did a long study on the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the so-called, quote, Soviet invasion of Poland of September 17, 1939. As with Khrushchev's speech, I myself was shocked by the extent to which these events continue to be falsified by the most respected historians. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact did not divide Eastern Europe, nor did the Soviet Union invade Poland. Articles on my webpage. I have read a good deal of research on the third Moscow trial, the Bukharin-Rykov trial. The evidence that Bukharin was guilty of at least what he confessed to is simply overwhelming. All of this research is linked on my homepage except for one long article that is about to appear in the forthcoming issue of Cultural Logic, which is an online journal. In general, there is no evidence that the testimony at any of the Moscow trials was faked. None. And there never has been. It's just assumed, right? The Kirov assassination of 1934. From September 2010 to August of this year, I researched and wrote a book on this subject. Now, we have a great deal of primary evidence on the Kirov murder. It's leaked out a little bit here, a little bit there in Russia. In my book, I demonstrate that this evidence proves that Kirov was indeed murdered by a secret Zinovievite terrorist group in Leningrad, and that this group was indeed led by Zinoviev and Kamenev in Moscow. In short, precisely as was accused in the first Moscow trial of August 1936. In 2010, I published a very long article in Cultural Logic in which I collect and assess all the evidence we now have from all sources, but mainly from former Soviet archives, that Leon Trotsky really did collaborate with the Germans and Japanese, as he was accused of doing in the Moscow trial. I conclude, as any objective study must, that all the evidence we now have supports the hypothesis that Trotsky did indeed collaborate with the Germans and Japanese. We have no evidence that this evidence was fabricated. In the course of doing this work, I began to encounter a great deal of evidence that Leon Trotsky was consistently lying in his writings about the Soviet Union during the 1930s. A few examples. There really was a block of oppositions, Rights, Trotskyites, and Zinovievites, just as alleged in the three Moscow trials. We know this from the Trotsky archives. Trotsky really was advocating murder against Stalin and other Soviet leaders, at exactly the same time he was telling the Dewey Commission and everyone else that he would never, ever, ever do that. We also know that Leon Sedov, Trotsky's son, had completely given up hope about his father's efforts, had become utterly demoralized, and was devoting as much time as he could to wine, alcoholism, women, affairs and prostitutes, and gambling, preferably at Monte Carlo. There is virtually no chance that the Soviet NKVD spy who managed to get next to Sedov, whose name was Borovsky, had anything to do with Sedov's death. In other words, Leon Sedov was not murdered by the Soviets. The last thing the Soviets wanted was for Sedov to be dead. With Borovsky as his right-hand man, they had the best inside information about what Trotsky was up to. Pierre Brouet, the leading Trotskyist historian in the world until his death in 2006, uncovered much of the stuff above and wrote about it. His material is little read, and interestingly, Brouet shied away from the implications of his own research, going so far as to ignore some of his own results. So I'm now working on a book-length project on Trotsky's lies and falsehoods in his writings during the 1930s. In short, the history of the Soviet Union must be completely rewritten. The narrative of Soviet history now in circulation is largely based upon lies and falsehoods. Since the end of the Soviet Union and the publication of a great many primary sources from former Soviet archives, we now have the raw material to get at the truth behind the lies of the anti-communists, both Russian and non-Russian. The 20th century was, in the main, the Soviet century. The eyes of the world were on the great Soviet experiment. The capitalists lied about it. Why shouldn't they lie? It was and is in their interest to lie about this greatest movement for human liberation in world history. Ultimately, tragically, the communist project of the Soviet Union failed. It failed not because of foreign conquest or subversion, but from internal errors. We must study the successes and failures of the Soviet history in order to learn how to imitate what the Soviets did that was correct, and avoid whatever it was they did that was mistaken. I am glad to play a very small role in this important work. Once again, I thank you for listening to my presentation and await your comments and criticisms with humility.